So the 61 Sprite that we worked on last year is back. So when we had this thing in here last year, it was only running on 3 cylinders due to some poorly adjusted valves. We got that all situated. Now the owner wants us to look at the brakes and suspension because that left front shock is pretty much not doing anything anymore. And the right rear shock is just marginal. The brakes have a lot of pedal travel, but they do come up a little bit on the second pump, which says at least some of that was within adjustment. But we're going to have to dig into it to find out what else we got going on. And hopefully, when we get into the front A-arms, that the bolt's not seized and hasn't chewed up the A-arms, because that causes us a lot more work and causes him to spend a bit more money. And then one other minor issue we got to take care of. When he went to start this thing up to bring it over here to drop it off, he had recently stuck a new battery in it, so he expected it to just crank right on up. Well, it didn't. So the owner said after cranking it over 4 or 5 revolutions, he noticed a little bit of smoke coming off of this connection here. Let's see what happens. Oop. We got nothing. So we check for power here. We got power to this side, but we pulled the switch. We only got 3 volts to here, and the wire is heating up quite a bit. So probably the first thing to do is to make sure that the starter itself isn't actually shorted out. So I think for sake of trying to film testing it, it's nicer to have it off the car here. Of course, it's not the easiest thing to get off because the oil filter sits right here and you can just barely get it out of there. When we look at this, it's a Napa reman starter. Date on it is 2016, so it's about 8 years old. I do notice so the bolts through here aren't tight enough. Bit of slop in it. But you see here, this has been quite hot and it's pretty loose in there. And it may not be insulating properly through there, maybe shorting out through that. Well, let's see what we get happen here. Well, it is actually working, so it should have worked in the car. Now the other problem potentially is the bolts holding this to the engine or back plate weren't overly tight. It may not have been getting a good ground, and the power wire here might have been shorting out to the casing here, but that I do see as a real problem. All right, so I took this cover loose here, and we get in here and we're looking, and yeah, there's no way that this thing is going to do much of anything. It's going to work, but still, no matter what we do, this is always going to get hot while cranking and just continue to melt that even further. So he does really need to replace the starter. So now on to looking at the brakes. This car has a kind of a soft pedal feel, and it's a bit on the low side, but it doesn't pump up and get higher by pumping it up, suggesting it's not just a adjustment issue. So I'm gonna get the wheels off, get the drums off, we'll take a look, see what we see. Now before I get the front wheels off of here, I just want to show you one of the issues with the Spridgets is they do have roller bearings for wheel bearings for the front, not tapered bearings like say the MGB would have in a lot of other cars. They can be a bit of a pain in that when you take the hubs off, they can actually come apart sometimes. because they are a thrust bearing. And if you put them in the wrong direction, a wheel can come off, because they only take thrust the one way more than they do the other. And replacements have been a problem for a few years, but this is what you get. There's wear in those bearings. Tightening them up isn't going to do a thing for them. You can't adjust that. They do sell a taper wheel bearing kit to replace the ball bearings, and I think now that those are available, that is the much better way to go on these, because you can't adjust them, you can tighten them, and get the clearances better. They're safer, they'll last you a lot longer, and they're much easier to service. And really the cost of them is not much different than what the other bearings were when they were available, which at least 2 moths are no longer available. But this prevents you from getting as good of a adjustment on drum brakes like the early ones have, like this one. Now, before the owner of this car knew that I was in the area, he had taken it to another local shop who doesn't specialize in any kind of British stuff. Had them put on rear wheel cylinders. Now, while they were doing that, they ended up putting on a brake line on this side. And boy, they didn't try at all. Look at that. And that's the Cupro nickel line. That stuff's so easy to bend. They could have had that bent running across there properly in about 2 minutes more than it took to do what they did there. So another interesting note of what they did when they put all this together, these wheel cylinders, they come with rubber bands around them when they're in the package. And that keeps this all together so that this doesn't come out while shipping. I don't know if you can actually see it or not, but the rubber band is still in there. Actually, when I first pulled the drum off, I was like, what the heck's this? Pop, like, oh yeah. So with the rubber band underneath there and going up underneath here, it makes it harder to get a good adjustment on the brakes. And once you press on the brake pedal, it has to compress that rubber before the pads actually properly engage the drum, making for a softer pedal. So we get into the front here. Looks like we got some leaking wheel cylinders, and of course now the shoes are covered in brake fluid. The other side actually doesn't look too bad. So what this thing's going to get now is wheel cylinders in the front. We're going to do shoes and upgrade to the tapered wheel bearings in the front end. The owner of the car is already okay doing all that. So one of the real issues with the roller style bearing is it is an interference fit. So you do have to pull it off of there, but a lot of times they don't just pull right off like super nicely, which this one did. If they're on there a little tight, when you do that, it can actually pull the wheel bearing apart. And once it pulls that apart, you're replacing them. Now we'll take this over to the workbench, take this out, and we'll show you that as we try to take it out, it will fall apart. So with these being roller bearings instead of tapered bearings, they're slightly harder to get out. Well, you can get out the seal here, and there's a spacer in here just like with the B and many other cars, British cars, and this spacer doesn't allow you to be able to actually get in there and push on either bearing on anything but the inner race. And if you're pushing on the inner race to try to get these out of there, really often the inner race and bearings will just pop out of the outer race. Then you got to knock the outer race out separately. And once that happens, you're replacing it. Now in this case, I don't care because we're obviously replacing all the bearings, but we can show you just how easy that can happen. It doesn't even take that much. You just of course, this one's not popping apart as easy as the other one. The other one, I barely hit it and it just fell right apart. Depends on how loose the bearing is. But oftentimes, you cannot get these things out of there without them falling apart. And of course, this one's going to make a liar out of me because it's on camera. And yeah, only about 30% of the time will that come out in one piece. But, oh well. Now that it's this way, we can get in here and actually get the outer race. And then once this is out, then we can push the new races in. Of course, with this conversion kit, you need to actually drive the races in. And if you're replacing tapered bearings on anything else, you should always replace the race as well, and not put a new bearing against an old race. But they put these little notches in here so that you can get a punch or something in there to drive them out. When you put them in, there's a couple ways you can do it. You can find a socket, or they make drivers specifically for doing this. Find one that's as close as you can get to the outer diameter. And you make sure the taper is out so that it'll actually fit in. You put it in the other way, you're going to take it back out. And you can do this and try to tap them in evenly, or you can take a copper or brass punch and kind of work your way around and keep it going nice and straight down in there until it bottoms out. You hear that change in sound, you know you've bottomed out, and then do the same thing for the other side. And of course there is a smaller one on the outside than on the inside. So basically, you're going to set this up pretty much just like you would an MGB, except that the big difference here is you don't have a separate spacer here like the B has. That's built into the spindle. And then get the first bearing on. Then they give you a little spacer to put in here. It makes up for the thickness of the inner bearing. And then put your spacer on here. And then the other bearing is going to go on, and that creates the space there. And then you'll put shims in here to get your clearance correct. And they say basically you're always going to have to shim it. They're pretty much never going to not. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the 20,000 shim as the base, because they say you're pretty much going to always need it anyway. Put the bearing on there, and you're going to snug it down. Of course, they give you a torque spec of, I think, 46 pounds you should be able to go to here. But basically, when you tighten this down, if you have play, which I do, then the 20 thousandths is too much. And you're going to just keep playing with the shims and combinations of the shims that's within the package that comes with it until you get to where it basically wants to spin freely, not tighten up, but not have a real perceivable play in it. If you really wanted to be technical about it, and you put a dial gauge on there, it should be like basically 2 or 3 thousandths, no more than 4. For those who want to get super technical, but you can do it by feel if you know what you're feeling for. And you just keep trying different combinations of shim until you get what you're looking for. And you must do this all while it's dry. No grease, no seal, no nothing. Then once you have it right, then you can take all those shims and stack them up for that side. Go back, pack your wheel bearings, put the seal in there, put it all back together with that same exact number of shims, tighten it down, put the cotter pin through it. So do both sides, then you can go on to finishing up the brakes or whatever you're doing on your car.